Let's first define what a bank is. A bank, over the last 500 years or so, has been effectively defined as a socially beneficial Ponzi scheme. If you are not an owner in this society of something, it doesn't matter what, but of something, you are going to get left behind extremely quickly. You can't be a wage earner and hope to keep up. Buy yourself a portfolio that consists of the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ 100 and forget about it. And then every time you have some spare money, buy some more. And just keep doing that. Don't do anything else. And you will, 10, 15, 17, 20 years later, be quite rich.
Samir, welcome back to the World XP podcast. How are you?
Thank you, sir. I am doing well, and I'm, as always, very glad to be back on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for those listening that were very excited for the last time that Samir was on, he brought with him like 4 guests right in a row. You guys will be in store for another round of Samir episodes. But for the people that didn't listen at all, do you want to do a quick intro elevator pitch for the people listening that didn't listen to the first one, and then we can hop right into it?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm Samir Varma. I am a physicist by training and nowadays also by profession, partly. I'm also a fund manager, which is my day job. And I'm also an author. You'll see over my shoulder, there's a blue book right about there called The Science of Free Will. And that's a book I wrote, which is on Amazon. I think it's a pretty fun book. It talks about how in a world where everything is governed by deterministic physical laws, you can still have free will. And what does it mean to have that free will? And how, particularly, because this is a philosophical question, does that apply to real life? And most importantly, how does it apply to artificial intelligence, which is the most important question of the moment? And I go through a lot of the actual underpinnings of how you should think about AI in the book. So yeah, that's my very short précis of a biography.
Yeah, fair enough. And for those listening, the book, it is not a like background type book. Like you have to pay attention in a good way. And so it took me some time, but it was a great, like, the questions in it, like you mentioned, the philosophical questions, it really makes you think. So so definitely recommend it. The link to that was in the last episode 205 that we did, and then I'll put it in the description to this one as well. So the question from the last guest for you, and I'm going to amend it slightly, but the question is, what work can you commit to today to do for a person or group in your community? And I'm kind of amend that to, what's something that you can do for your community or family, like in the near term, that maybe you haven't been doing?
Well, that's a good question. I think the answer actually is to remain calm during political debates, and then try as best I can to get both sides to be able to talk to each other. And I'm fairly happy to say that I have been reasonably successful in doing that, and I've been trying to do it more and more, actually, because I've noticed with a large number of people, family members, friends, neighbors, particularly neighbors, that they have a very fixed set of beliefs, which is fine. They can believe whatever they want. But then when confronted with the facts, that turns into a little bit of an argument, particularly with the talking to each other. And I found it my job to sort of stick my nose in the middle and say, hey, guys, have you considered this and have you considered that? And sort of explain each side's argument to the other, because I find that they're always talking past each other. And so my hope is that if I can get people to talk to each other, then it doesn't mean that they have to believe differently than they do, but at least they'll understand what the other side is trying to say, as opposed to try to set up a straw man and then fight that straw man, which I think is always a bad idea.
Yeah. You know what's funny? Actually, I have found myself in the similar sort of scenarios often, and doing the same sort of thing, which is like you'll hear a friend or something make a claim from a headline or something that I would have in my psycho ways have been well researched on, because apparently I don't have enough time, or have too much time anyways. And so, yeah, I do the same. And it's very interesting because if you come at it from a place of, and I found some reasonable success doing this as well, if you come at it from a place where people say or people think, and here's why, and these are the facts, of why they think that, and you can frame it in such a way that it's like, hey, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you what they said and why they said it. Um, then sometimes you can find a reasonable amount of success doing that. And I think to some extent it does take time, right? Like one of those doesn't fix anything in terms of like you might get through on that one particular issue where it's like, oh, okay, I understand now. But then, as you know, there's a whole host of like, and for people listening, you probably know this as well. You can probably guess if a person gives an opinion on one subject, one political subject, you can probably guess what their opinions are on the other 100 that are in the news. And so that, I mean, is a little bit unfortunate. But if you go kind of systematically and one thing here, one thing there, and then before you know it, then you can actually kind of set up a reasonable conversation where you people actually think about what it like, okay, why are we doing this and why is it good and why is it not good? Not I heard somebody say it online, and therefore I also believe it. Because, I mean, all of these things are very complex, and to have and people have too much going on. They're picking up their kids from T-ball or whatever to really make a deep dive into it. So, anyways, but I did want on one of those issues, I did want to pick your brain a little bit on kind of the macro economy and what we've been seeing recently. There's kind of the big thing that the last political campaigns were ran on was they called it the unaffordability crisis, which I think is unfortunate because, you know, like a year ago they were calling it inflation, which is more accurate to what it actually is. But just moving forward in the future, and I'll finish with this and then let you go. Like my little brother is gonna graduate from high school soon, and I was telling him if you have a job, you everything needs to be invested somewhere because your dollars are gonna be like it's going down too quickly, and you need to put it somewhere to preserve the value. Um, just to have it, because now it's not investing. Almost to me isn't a positive. Now it's like staying. Of course, the value, the number will go up, but if you're not doing that, then you're falling behind. Where I think as maybe 30 years ago or 20 years ago, if you were saving, there was still a path to save and you would still be in a good spot. Anyway, so I'll leave it there and then let you take it wherever you want.
Yeah, that's true. Um, and it's true for a large number of reasons. And if you, when you put all those reasons together, you get the result that we have now. So I'm going to try to run through a few of them because there's a lot of them. So the first problem is that we have created an economy which is heavily financialized. Now, what does that mean? It means that more and more of the economy is run as if it was a financial asset and less as if it was, you know, something else. Now, that has benefits. You get you get financial discipline, you know, you get operational control and so on. But frequently, it also has very big downsides when you get things like asset stripping, or you get, you know, people basically taking away whatever the special sauce of the business was when they quote financialize it. That's one problem. The second problem is that combined with that, you have the issue that to a large extent, risk has been socialized. And what I mean by that is that you have a fair number of financial institutions that are too big to fail at this point. Now, some of those financial institutions that are too big to fail, like, for example, JP Morgan, do a very good job of managing their risk and not being a burden to society. But a lot of them do not. And then when they blow up, particularly if they blow up en masse, like they did in 2008, well, the costs are our problem, right? The poor old taxpayer has to bear that. That's the second problem. The third problem is that we have a lot of NIMBYs now. And that actually, in my opinion, might even be the biggest problem. And the NIMBYs use the regulatory state to stop anybody from doing anything. You want to build a new apartment complex? Oh, no, 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 not near me. You want to build a new road? Oh, no, 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 not near me. You want to build a new highway? Oh, no, 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 not near me. And so on. And what that does is that it creates a situation where housing in particular becomes more and more and more expensive. And the more expensive you make housing relative to people's incomes, the more upset they are because, as you just said, 20, 25, 30 years ago, you could start off with nothing, as my wife and I did, by the way, and be able to save enough money relatively quickly to be able to afford something approaching a house. That's very difficult today. And that's because the price of housing has gone up, and that's because we don't build enough of it. And the reason we don't build enough of it is simply because we have too many NIMBYs, too many regulations, and too much weaponization of law. And then the last major problem is that when you put all of these things together, you end up with a situation where it's only the owners of assets that really make out in a big way. And so what you said earlier is very true. If you are not an owner in this society of something, it doesn't matter what, but of something, you are going to get left behind extremely quickly. You can't be a wage earner and hope to keep up with the way the economy is currently structured. You have to invest in something. And one of the easiest things, of course, to invest in is the stock market, which is absolutely fine. You should. But there are other things you can do too. You can invest in real estate, and you can invest in other productive assets if you want to. Dry cleaners, for example, just to give you an off-the-wall example. So those are all things you can do, but you have to invest in something, because if you don't, you're going to get left behind, exactly as you said.
Can you define NIMBY?
Yeah, NIMBY is not in my backyard.
Okay, gotcha. Makes sense.
So you have a lot of people that do that. And in every affluent community in the country, every single one of them where people want to live, essentially everybody is a NIMBY. And that's because they just don't want to see anything that changes their way of life. And to some extent, I can understand that. You don't want the crowds, you don't want the pressure on the schools, you don't want this, you don't want that. I understand that. But the problem is, if everyone's a NIMBY, then there's no building going on. Or whatever building is going on is high end, or it's expensive, or it's stuff that people can't afford, and so on. And of course, the perfect example of this is Manhattan, which no one can afford at this point.
Yeah. I want to touch a little bit on 2008 and kind of how the banks work, because as soon as you said that the financial institutions were socialized, immediately my brain went to 2008, which is, of course, is what you were alluding to. And I want to touch a little bit on, just for people listening, how the banks actually work and how the financial institutions actually work, because even for me, like, I think I understand it a little bit, but it's still relatively confusing, because it seems, when I kind of try to research, it seems like there's these games that are being played with the books and what's called an asset and what's called a liability, and how the books are balanced, and do they actually have the money, and why is the Federal Reserve doing this, and who's paying for what, and why can we just print unlimited amounts of money, and where, like, it doesn't seem from the outside looking in, it seems very kind of haphazard, and I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but for people listening, can you sort of describe how the financial institutions got to where they're so big that they're too big to fail, and then how they actually work in terms of, like, within the financial world, not necessarily from a front facing, like, to you or me or to whoever, but within themselves, how they actually work.
So that's two questions. Let me answer the second first, and then if I forget the first one, remind me.
Yep, got you.
Okay. So let's first define what a bank is. That's the most important question, because a lot of people that even work in finance don't understand what a bank is. A bank, over the last 500 years or so, has been effectively defined as a socially beneficial Ponzi scheme. That's exactly what it is. Now, what does that mean? Suppose that you had what's called a narrow bank. So basically, you and I have some money. We go to a narrow bank. The narrow bank takes our deposit, and it takes the money and deposits it at the Federal Reserve. And it does nothing else with that money. It collects some interest from the Federal Reserve, it takes a portion for its services, and it gives us back the rest of the interest. That's a narrow bank that has no risk whatsoever. But it also has no benefit to the economy, because that money is going straight back to the Federal Reserve. It's not being lent. It's not starting new businesses. It's not building new houses. It's not making new loans. It's not making new purchases of cars. It's not doing anything. So what we do is we say, look, Mr. Bank, you are allowed to make loans with the money that people deposit, under the statement that not every depositor is going to come and ask for all his money back on the same day. In other words, if they have $100 of deposits, it's not going to be true that all $100 are going to vanish the same day. So then you end up with what's called fractional reserve banking, where some portion of the money that is deposited is kept in very safe assets. And then some portion of that money, usually a pretty large fraction of it, is lent out for projects that the bank thinks are profitable. And we all pretend collectively that that this is not risky. So that's why you have the phrase, well, it says it's money in the bank. Yes, but the bank is actually a very risky thing, but we treat it as if it's not. But since the incentive of the bank is to make loans, and because, of course, the risk is partly backstopped by the government, you also have the government regulating the banks to try to make sure that they don't overloan things. And so that's why you have all kinds of questions about, I've made this loan, how much capital do I need to reserve against it? I've made this loan, how much capital do I need to reserve against that? So different assets have different risk weights, and you basically multiply all the assets by all the risk weights, you add it all up, and that becomes the sort of risk capital that the bank has at risk. And then banking regulation turns into a big argument between regulators and banks about how much capital they have to hold against various kinds of assets. And so that's where the games occur. If I sell this asset, but I buy that asset, well, then for regulatory purposes, it'll seem that I'm lower risk, so I can do more of this lending and so on. That's how it works. Now, by and large, given that we all suspend disbelief together and we have a backstop in the form of the federal government, this is a socially beneficial enterprise. The time when it becomes non-socially beneficial is when the banks go crazy and they start making really insane loans because they're all competing with each other to make the loans. And knowing in effect that if they don't make the loan, some other crazy competitor will come and make the loan. So they might as well make the loan because somebody else will make it anyway. And then that's the job of the regulators to stop. Most of the time it works. Once in a while it doesn't, and you end up with a banking crisis. Now, the reason for the too big to fail issue is that in the past, we used to have a system of banking where the capital of the bankers was at risk all the time. So like in the old days before year 2000, we used to have this thing called Glass-Steagall, which was the act that separated commercial banking, that is the banking that you and I deal with, and investment banking, which is the banks that a large company would deal with. And in particular for the investment banks, the capital that they had at risk was the partners' capital. So, Mr. Goldman and Mr. Sachs, that's why it's called Goldman Sachs, would have their capital at risk, right? And then as partners came along, they always put their capital at risk. Then afterwards, that turned out to be no longer true because the commercial banks and the investment banks merged and became one operation. And then investment banks started to take outside capital. They became companies that floated on the stock exchange as opposed to big partnerships and so on. So very quickly it turned into other people's money. And what always happens on Wall Street when you have other people's money is heads I win, tails you lose. Why is that? For one very, very simple reason. You get paid your bonus once a year. Now, if you take lots of risk, and by taking all that risk, there's a giant profit, you get a share of the profit, you're a very happy guy. If on the other hand, you take a giant risk and it blows up, it's not your money. It didn't cost you anything. It cost you your job, perhaps, but that doesn't really matter because then you go get another job. So this is the issue, is that always you have this mismatch when people's own capital is not at stake. And what's happened with the commercial banks and the investment banks, because now basically one and the same thing, is that their own capital is much less at stake than it used to be. And so it's you're really playing with other people's money.
Mm. So, okay, I have two thoughts on that. The first is the other people's money thought. This is kind of, you'll see posts like this on social media sometimes where it's like how the wealthy buy things. They will take a loan out against their assets, and therefore they're using somebody else's money to buy a house or a new car or pay for some vacation or whatever it is. And then, so that's how they do that, which means that they don't have to liquidate anything and then they can pay it back over time, again, using somebody else's money to do that. And then, depending on what it is, of course, if they pay for some vacation and they have enough reasonable cause, they can say it's a business trip expense or whatever, and they can write it off. Anyways, there's a whole nother tax scheme that goes along with that, which is a different conversation. The second one is, so when you mentioned the combination of the commercial and the investment banks, so how does the Fed fit in? Because there's a kind of a group on the libertarians like kind of mindset that is very much end the Fed. The Fed needs to be abolished or at least audited, things like that. And then I was also listening to this guy named Dr. Richard Werner who says that the banks don't actually have, you mentioned the fraction that they keep. He's like, well, the banks actually don't have any at all. And to me, I was like, okay, well, what's the difference? If they have 5% or 5% of it or 0%, it doesn't matter because they still don't have it. It's still a low percent. So to me, in practice, it doesn't actually make that much of a difference, other than the fact that they're slightly more insane, maybe. So I guess that there's a lot in there, but I want to go off kind of because the other thing that he mentioned was, and I'm going to tie this all together, was we had lots of regional and local banks before, and that seemed to be a better way of doing it. So, and I think that ties into the abolish the Fed question, but I'll let you go on kind of those thoughts and how they combine because they make sense to me a little bit, but I can't quite articulate it to somebody else, maybe, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. So let's talk about the abolish the Fed question. So the problem with the abolish the Fed question is that it's not that there's anything philosophically wrong with that stance. Because what basically they're saying then is that each bank will be responsible for its own debts, and it will be up to each customer to know how creditworthy their bank is. And therefore, each bank can even issue its own banknotes, and those banknotes will have a haircut depending on what people think in the market about the creditworthiness of that bank. That's the libertarian position. I understand it. I sympathize with it. Hell, I'm a libertarian myself, but I'm a libertarian with a small L.
Yeah.
And what that means is that I'm a libertarian that thinks more in terms of what's possible rather than what in some ideal world I might, with a utopian vision, be able to conjure up. And I think the problem is that the idea that people are smart enough and knowledgeable enough to be able to figure out how risky their bank is pretty unrealistic. I mean, if you look at how much, do you know how much due diligence the average person does before they buy a stock? You're going to laugh.
Probably
They've done this survey. It's very close to none. It's under 2 minutes. Right?
I mean, that's not surprising at all. But
it's not surprising, right? It's the same problem. So it's, how will you know whether your bank is solvent? Or because, so-and-so told me, or that newspaper told me, or that journalist told me, or whatever. So that's the real problem with the idea of caveat emptor. Everybody will look out for themselves, and there'll be all these regional banks, and we can't have a banking crisis. That's one big problem with it. The second problem with it is that it ignores the fact that there are significant economies of scale when it comes to banking. And by making every bank a small regional bank, you are basically losing all those economies of scale. And there are multiple economies of scale. The first economy of scale is that as you learn how to make loans, for example, that learning can be transferred to a lot more areas rather than just, if you're in Little Rock, Arkansas, well, if you figure out how to make loans in Little Rock, Arkansas, now you can make loans in New Haven, Connecticut too. But you won't be able to do that if the banks are very small. The second thing is that larger banks can fund larger projects. So, for example, let's say that SpaceX is now talking about going public at, I think, an $800 billion valuation or something, which would be, I think, the largest IPO in history, or the second largest IPO or something or the other, whatever. But the point is only, twofold. One, it would be extremely difficult for SpaceX to go for an IPO without large banks behind it because they have to underwrite the IPO. That's the first thing. And the second is along the way, they've done hundreds of billions of dollars of financing. And with no large banks available to help them with that financing, they would never be able to do it. The same thing is true for OpenAI. The same thing is true for Tesla in its earlier days anyway. Larger companies need larger banks. Now, the response would be we could have some larger banks that are separate from the smaller banks and so on. But it turns into a mess. And even if you could somehow say, the system should look like this, there's no significant path to get there from here.
Yeah.
So we're kind of stuck in this equilibrium where we have a Federal Reserve that is the backstop to a large number of banks. And it's the Federal Reserve's job to, A, make sure they don't take too much risk, and at the same time be the backstop in case anything really goes wrong. The Federal Reserve is always there as a provider of liquidity of last resort. And the other thing that I would say to everybody is that be careful what you wish for, because think about the panic of 1905, 6, 7, 10, 13. I can never remember the date. It would have turned into a massive financial crisis had JP Morgan, the man, not stepped in and bailed everybody out. I don't think we want to be in a financial situation where we have to say, go running to Warren Buffett to say, for example, hey, Warren, give us some money because the country's about to fall apart. That would be pretty bad too. So there are really strong counter arguments. And then the other issue is that if you want to do that, if you really want to go back to a sort of libertarian banking situation, then you really also need to go back onto the gold standard. And I used to be a proponent myself, by the way, of the gold standard many years ago. But the thing is that in a modern economy, it's extremely difficult to see how the gold standard could function. Because what you'll end up with is if you look at, for example, the price of gold in terms of dollars, that's telling you something about the volatility of gold.
Mm-hmm.
It's also telling you something of the volatility of dollars, I know, before fans of gold come and chop my head off. But it's also telling you something about the volatility of gold. And so then the argument that they're going to make is, well, the volatility of gold is going to be less than the volatility of dollars. Maybe, maybe not, because I would point out to them, again, I used to be a fan of the gold standard, that there've been plenty of periods in the past where you've had large amounts of gold inflow and large amounts of gold outflow, which have caused inflations and deflations, even on, even on the gold standard. So it's much trickier than the proponents think it is.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes total sense. And I think on to your point about, well, big banks can finance bigger projects, then you might get the argument of like, well, look at what all these big projects have and big companies have done. All they've done is buy up all the small businesses, and now we kind of live in a monopolized economy to some extent, right? We've got the biggest companies in the world, Walmart, Amazon, Apple, Google, etc. And then small businesses are struggling massively. And I think it's tough to get into the, like, where's the happy medium, because the big companies are always eating up the little ones, and banks as well, right? The big banks are buying out the regional and the local ones. And so you end up with this kind of situation where, like, where's the happy medium? And it's tough to regulate that, because then you get into regulatory capture and all the other things that, again, is a different conversation. But it just feels like you said, there's no viable path to get back to that. But also, like, if it keeps going, where does it go to? Like, where, like, the regular person is kind of left behind as the numbers keep getting bigger, the companies keep getting bigger, the supply chains keep getting more complicated, and then it has a trickle down effect of where, okay, well, now I can't buy a house. And like, so what do you do with that? Like, where's the solve for, okay, makes sense, but then how do you get everybody else on board with that? And how do you ensure, for example, like, with maybe Amazon's not a good example because they've got a lot of sellers, but like, how do you ensure that, like, maybe Nike is selling shoes for a reasonable, like, $100 when it costs them $2 to make it instead of 200, where it's like they don't need to sell them for 200, you could argue, for example, right? So how do you get that where you bring everybody else along with it?
So the question you have to ask yourself is the following. What is the purpose of an economy? The purpose of an economy, and this is a point that is all too often forgotten, is to consume. It is not anything else. It is purely to consume.
What would you say to the people? What would you say to the people that say it's like the voluntary? They would say the definition is like the voluntary trade and exchange of goods and services.
Sure, but why? Why do you exchange goods and services? To consume them.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, absolutely, voluntary exchange of services and goods. Yes, but the purpose of having those voluntary goods and services is to consume them. Now, this is important, and the reason this is important is it actually focuses you on the question, which is, when you are trying to decide if something is good or bad for the economy, you should be asking a very important question: is this good or bad for the consumer? The biggest difference between the United States, which is why it's successful, and Europe, which is in the process of shooting itself in the foot and in other parts of the body, is that US antitrust law and other laws in general have been focused for a long time on what's good for the consumer. Whereas in Europe, they're focused much more on what's good for the producer. And this is a giant error that they are making, a demonstrable error, as a matter of fact, because what is in the interests of Volkswagen doesn't mean that that's in the interests of all of the people in Germany. What's in the interest of Volkswagen is for them to sell their cars at the highest prices that they can possibly get. It's not to produce the best possible car at the lowest possible price for their consumers. That is one giant issue. So you always have to focus on who is benefiting and who is losing in this particular arena. So if you look at these large companies, Amazon, for example, is an excellent example. If it was not for Amazon, just consider how bad COVID would have been for all of us.
Yeah, not
I
great.
would argue to you, not great. I would argue to you that the reason that COVID turned out for all of us to be much less unpleasant than it could have been is because of e-commerce companies like Amazon.
Yeah.
That's so there is a huge social benefit to the fact that Amazon is a very large company. The same thing is true, by the way, I'm not a fan of Google for reasons we can get into in another podcast, but the same thing is true, for example, for Google. A lot of the services that it's providing are a massive benefit to people. The same thing is true for Facebook. I refuse to use Facebook because I don't like it, but lots of people do. And I'm a libertarian. I don't tell you what you can do and what you can't do. Lots of people like it. If you do the study to ask how much would people charge to give up Facebook, it's a lot of money, which tells you something about how much they value it. And yet it's free. So it's not the largeness of the companies that's the problem. The problem is when the companies become anti-competitive. And again, not that I really want to compliment the federal government about anything, because I never really want to. They've more or less, over the last 35, 40 years, more or less, with exceptions, got that mostly right. That is to say, when there has been blatantly anti-competitive behavior, they have more or less gone after it and more or less stopped it. What they have not stopped, despite what the people from the last administration tried to do, was to go after companies simply for being big. So you have to separate bigness from anti-competitiveness. And that, I think, is the main distinction that you always want to keep in mind. Now, going back to housing, it's not that the large companies are causing the housing problem.
No.
It's that the building restrictions that are constantly being placed in the way, and the regulations and the permitting issues and all the rest of it, stops there being any significant building taking place in those areas. And now people will accuse me of being Pollyannish, but in fact, go look at Texas. In Texas, like for example in Houston or in Dallas, these are booming cities, but they have not had the kind of crazy ass increase in property values that other cities have. Why? Because in Texas, they more or less encourage people to go and build. Houston famously has no zoning whatsoever. It's starting to come and there are some restrictions now, but they're not particularly onerous. In Houston, you can more or less build anything you want. The result of this is there's plenty of housing and it's a booming city. Now, put all of that together and you say, okay, well, I as a single guy, whatever it is, I'm thinking about my life. There's nothing I can do about any of this, which is absolutely true. There's nothing you can do about any of it except one thing, which is that if it is your feeling that these large companies are dominating the economy and going to make large profits, hey, we're a capitalist society. Buy shares in those companies. Go along for the ride. And so that goes right back to the original point that you made earlier, which is that if you're not an investor, you're in trouble.
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at, which is either it's not that the big companies are making houses more expensive, but it's the combination of the banks loaning bigger and bigger amounts, and then the federal government printing more and more money to kind of backstop the bigger like the numbers keep going up, the wages are not going up, and like you said, if you're a wage earner and you're not an owner, you're going to get left behind. And like we also said, how many people are going to do the due diligence to either own a stock that makes any sense or like trust if we were in the regional bank scenario, trust that that bank was not going to go under anytime soon. So that's kind of the question of what I'm getting at, because it's either an education question in which you teach people about the stock market and how to invest and how to do that, or wages have to come with it. And that's the thing that I think, at least from a political perspective, it's a very easy, like, it's a this is why the raising the minimum wage argument gets so much, it's so popular, because it seems like a very quick fix to this problem, but it doesn't account for other things that go with it. So, is it an education problem in your opinion, or like is just the way of the future everyone needs to be invested in the stock market and that's how it goes if you want to do it, or what is your opinion on that?
So the thing to understand if you're an ordinary investor is that you actually have a giant advantage over professional investors. And that huge giant advantage is that you don't have any pressure. Now, what does that mean? It means that when you're a professional investor, you're always being judged against some benchmark. Did you beat the S&P over the last month? Did you beat it over the last quarter? What did your risk profile look like? What stocks had you purchased? Were you in the better stocks for the quarter? All of this nonsense. There's lots of noise around this situation. You, on the other hand, because you have no pressure on you, can simply buy yourself an ultra cheap index fund or an index ETF. And you can actually so if you decide that you want to buy a very broad market ETF, buy yourself the SPY, the S&P 500. It costs nothing for the commission, and the management fee, I think, is, I don't know, 0.1% per year or something, equally negligible. Don't worry about it. That ETF, by the way, will beat 95% of all investments that you can make an investment in over any significant period of time. Certainly over your lifetime, it'll beat every professional investor you can think of, with a few exceptions, which you couldn't get into anyway. That's the first thing. The second thing is, those things have such low fees that there's no interest in selling them to you. Nobody wants to sell them to you. You have to buy them yourself. What Wall Street wants to sell you, particularly when you start to make a little bit of money, let's say you have $500,000 or $750,000, whatever, is all these newfangled products. They want to sell you private equity, and they want to sell you on deal flow, and they want to. You always ask, why is he selling this to me? As the old a book, which is a great book called "Where Are the Customers' Yachts?" You should always ask that question: where are the customers' yachts? The answer is there is almost no situation in which a Wall Street guy comes to you and says to you, hey, do you want to buy this? That the answer should be yes. It should almost always be no, with very rare exceptions. Buy yourself an index fund, a broad index fund to begin with. And then let's say that you are convinced that the tech industry is going to be very dominant in the United States over the next 15, 20, 30 years, whatever. Great. Then you have a second index fund that you can buy called QQQ, which is the NASDAQ 100, right? So buy yourself a portfolio that consists of the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ 100 and forget about it. And then every time you have some spare money, buy some more. And just keep doing that. Don't do anything else. And you will 10, 15, 17, 20 years later be quite rich. It's that simple. And so all of the hand-wringing about what these larger companies are doing, in some sense, is pointless, because you too can be an owner of those large companies. Now, the place this becomes a little bit unfair, which to its credit, again, I hate giving them credit, but anyway, to its credit, this administration is kind of trying to fix, is that some of these really good investments stay private a very long time. They stay private a very long time because the regulations for being public are so stupid in many cases. So SpaceX is still private, right? OpenAI is still private. Anthropic, which is Claude, is still private, and so on. It would be great as a public investor if these companies were public, so you could buy some shares in them, but you can't because they're staying private. That part is still pretty bad. In a capitalist society, we should be allowed to buy those shares, and we're not allowed to buy them because of absurd regulation. Genuinely absurd regulation, which I won't bore everybody with. That's the one part that is very, very hard to defend. And that's the one part in which you are losing out to professionals. But then having said that, the number of professionals that can invest in those companies is, that's
Yeah.
small anyway. So back to square one, just buy yourself some nice broad stock market indexes and then don't worry about it. And you'll actually do extremely well
So how does that,
over the long run.
so I got another couple thoughts on that. One, does, so does the number just continue to grow for an infinite, like, are we always up and to the right until, like, for generally speaking, right, there will be dips and whatever, but
With
is
risk,
that,
yes. I mean, there's always a risk that stock markets go down, of course.
but like in terms of
Sure.
a giant crash, like it seems like we're flirting with, I don't know, right? Because we've got the national debt as well. And
Yep.
so, and like you said, I think it's kind of a wait and see on that on the last time that we were on with John. But like it seems like we're kind of flirting with some kind of like, well, everything comes crumbling down at some point because somewhere along the chain can't make the payment that they need to have the next person make their payment because the whole financial system is just a giant circle of IOUs essentially. And so if somebody can't make the payment, then it feels like just looking from the outside and also knowing you can't do anything about it, it's like, well, that's not great. And then kind of the second piece is just because you own a piece of the S&P 500, that doesn't really solve the problem of like local communities and small entrepreneurs wanting to have the capital to then start something up because you can buy that, but then you have to be knowledgeable enough to either have enough to take a loan out against it to start your business, or you have to sell it to liquidate the capital to then start your own business. And that still like and that still to me, regardless of all the positives that you've laid out for, right, Amazon helped us get through COVID, et cetera, that still to me is a big problem because from a societal perspective in the fabric of a local community, you don't have, oh yeah, I'm gonna go get my meat from the local farmer's market, and I know the farmer and his name is Joe, and like that relationship, and I know that Joe's not gonna screw me over and put a bunch of preservatives in the food, blah blah blah, right? All these things, right? Because if you were to go ask somebody on the street, do you think that the big companies in the US or the federal government has the interest of the consumer in mind? They would probably tell you no, I think.
Well, okay, there's actually three questions in there.
Yes, there is.
Yes. Okay. So the first is having to do with what happens with the debt,
Yeah.
right?
Does
So
the giant bubble pop at some
yeah. So
point slash
let's
is it a
talk about
bubble?
that.
Yep, let's do
Let's
it.
talk about that. That's question one. Question two is about large companies,
Hmm.
right? And then question and investing in them. And then question three is about what do people do if they want to run a small business,
And the societal
and
implications of that.
societal implications.
I'm more interested in the societal piece of that rather than like the money and the numbers, like to create a community that's cohesive and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So let's start with the first question first,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So the first thing to understand is that an economy, particularly the United States, is not a household.
Yep.
A household, a household, if it runs up very large debts, will eventually default on them. But an economy like the US doesn't need to default on debt, even if it becomes unmanageable. And the reason is that what a government in the United States' position will do if the debt keeps growing, because we seem to have no spending discipline. So yeah, it'll keep growing, is the following. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to increase the inflation rate a little bit. So instead of the 2% target, you might start to see 4%. So at a 4% inflation rate, you start to cut your debt to GDP ratio, which is the thing that you need to worry about, at a reasonably healthy clip. So that's the first bit of skullduggery that will happen. The second bit of skullduggery that will happen is something called financial repression. And what happens in financial repression is that you require your financial institutions to make certain loans at certain fixed rates, right? So that's a second way. So you say to them, you have to buy these treasury bonds, and we're not going to pay you more than 4% interest on them. And with a 4% inflation rate, if you have to buy your bonds at 4%, your rate of return is zero, right? That's financial repression. So that's the second thing governments will do. And the United States, because it is the United States, will be able to do without too much trouble. The third thing the United States can do, which it will do also, is it will devalue the dollar, again, slowly. Because there's no appetite for tax increases, and there's no appetite for spending cuts. One or more of those three things is going to happen for sure. But it doesn't necessarily need to mean a default. And the reason is that you can keep this spinning more or less permanently by doing those three things. So that's the first point.
Okay, so just real quick, you mentioned about bonds. For people listening, bonds were always sold as the when you're close to retirement age, buy bonds because it's very low risk. Don't buy bonds anymore, right? This is not, in my opinion, you might maybe slightly disagree, but to me, I wouldn't do it. That's I would stay away from that, generally speaking, now at this point.
I would too, and just to make you laugh a little bit, do you know that Microsoft pays a lower rate on its bonds than the US government?
No, I didn't know that. Thank you for that.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Isn't that funny?
Need a little chuckle.
Yeah, it's really true. Anyway, so those are things that the government can do and it will do, and it's inevitable because again we have no appetite for cutting spending and we have no appetite for raising taxes. Okay, now coming back to the second point, the purpose of a business is to serve its customers, right? So, and again, this is our pure libertarian view, which you and I both share. If you are not creating a voluntary exchange with your customer, whereby both sides get something from the transaction, then you have not created value for your customer and that transaction should not be taking place. So if you are a small business, your job is to find that niche in your community that is not being filled by the larger businesses that are there. Now, what might that be? Now, this will surprise you. It sure surprised me. My original expectation was that years ago was that Amazon would start to kill local bookstores. But in fact, the exact opposite has happened. Lots of communities now have local bookstores that are thriving. And the reason they're thriving is that the bookstores pivoted away from being just, here's a book, to we'll curate a selection for you. We'll find you a book to read, given that we know your tastes. We're going to have readings. We'll have, authors coming in to sign books. We'll have a cafe. We'll do this, we'll do that, and so on. We'll have local books that might be of interest to you that you won't see elsewhere, and so on. And so what you find all of a sudden is that local business, which is a bookstore, in the age of Amazon, is thriving.
They're creating an experience rather than selling a product. Yeah.
Exactly. So before my book came out, I did a tour of 3 cities. I went to Toronto, I went to London, and then I went to all the way from Boston to Philadelphia. And I hit in person, I counted something like 80 bookstores all over the place. And in every community, they were all doing great. And because they were all curating an experience, exactly as you just said. Including one that was really interesting. That's a houseboat on a barge moored on a canal in London.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so people come there to buy books just because they want to come buy a book on a houseboat. Which is pretty cool.
Fair enough, I guess.
Which is cool. So anyway, that's what the local businesses have to do. But having said that, there are problems with what I'm saying. The biggest problem actually comes with medical care.
Yes.
And what has been happening, right? What's happening with medical care is that you're getting private equity firms that are buying up more and more small medical practices and rolling them up and then putting them together so that they have, economies of scale and so on and so forth. Now, in one sense, this is good because they do upgrade a lot of the stuff. They upgrade the electronics and they upgrade the software,
the physical stuff,
the equipment, the physical stuff. But at the on the other side, it's easier to get an appointment and so on. On the other side, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the care is actually becoming more expensive
And less personal.
and less personal. And so the question becomes, is that a bad thing or a good thing? And I think with all of these things, as always, some of it is bad, some of it is good. Is it good on balance? I don't actually know. My guess is that if you looked at it as an economist and you ran the numbers, you'd probably find it was a net benefit. If you looked at it the way I do as a patient, it's probably a net, detriment. So how to think about it, I don't know. Do I have a solution for it? Absolutely not. But that is the kind of business where this sort of roll up, financialization, Wall Street, private equity, blah blah blah, does seem to have, at least experientially, effects that are not great.
Yeah. So I think, well, to your point, I think this is going to be, it's a very much an age of transition, right? Where if a local business owner can harness AI to be productive for him, maybe him or her, maybe send out marketing emails and all these like kind of maximize efficiency on a lot of sort of mundane tasks and find a niche that works best for them, even if it's, for example, maybe a local clinic where you've got maybe a physical therapist that in town, the physical therapy is ran by some big corporation and they're not really great or whatever. Like I had somebody that I knew or that I know very well going for a cardiology appointment, and the doctor kind of she saw the doctor for 4 minutes. Basically, they just asked her if she was anxious and then tried to push some like anti-anxiety pills, and that was it. And it's like, what, like, first of all, with all the problems of SSRIs and the anti-anxiety medication and Adderall and all the rest of them, one, like, you spent 4 minutes with this person, she didn't list anxiety as one of the symptoms, and that's your answer. So, like, I think there are opportunities there where if you can get the capital to start up something like that, I think people can be largely successful in creating a little niche for themselves as a specialist in some area, even in the sort of medical industry, or others as well. And I had another question and I forgot what it was. Um,
You want to talk about doctors for a moment?
sure, we could do that.
So the reason I bring it up is that I have a lot of friends who are doctors.
Yeah.
And so one of the problems that they tell me about is that because of the way reimbursement rates work, two issues come up. The first is that for routine appointments, they're given so little in terms of the amount of money that they get for that routine appointment that they really only are going to give you those 4 minutes and very little of their attention. That's the first problem. The second problem is that some of the reimbursement rates are wildly out of whack. So when they do some very risky, very complicated operation, they may make $700, which takes with lots of reputational risk. Whereas some very easy operation might be $5,000. And so obviously you have the incentive to go keep doing the easy operation and not do the difficult one. That has to do with the reimbursement rate problems. And then that is compounded when they become part of a private equity practice, because now the private equity practice is trying to maximize the amount of revenue that it's going to get. So it's going to push it more and more to the easy operation will make $5,000 as opposed to the difficult one who makes 700. So that causes that problem. So one way that these doctors are opting out of the rat race altogether is that they're just not taking insurance anymore.
Yes, I've seen this before. Yeah.
So in our area here in Connecticut, the better doctors, almost none of them take insurance at this point. So you basically have to go pay out of pocket and then you submit it to insurance company. You get paid, maybe 30 cents on the dollar, 25 cents on the dollar. But that's the only way to get really good care, because otherwise you basically go, you get your 4 minutes exactly as you just said, probably something wildly inappropriate, like SSRIs, and you haven't really achieved anything. Now, how do you solve that? Again, I have lots of ideas, but getting from here to there is going to be very difficult.
Yeah. Well, that exactly what you said seems like what health insurance in its purest form is actually for, where it's like you pay a little bit a month and then when need to go see somebody, they reimburse you for that expert care, which is what you needed the big chunk of money to go see in the first place. Like that seems like what it was meant for. I've seen are you familiar with I think it's called Crowd Health or something like that? It's kind
No,
of
don't
like
know about it.
it's kind of like I've seen it as an ad on some podcasts. It's basically you pay a little bit a month and then like since everybody pays in, then you can submit. But it's like the company is not like an insurance company. It's basically like
Hmm.
a giant GoFundMe a little bit. And so I'd be interested to see how well that's working or not working. I've not really done any deep dives on that. But like you said before, and like we were talking about with the small businesses, there seems to be areas of opportunity for people where these kind of behemoths of companies are not serving the needs of their customers. So I don't
Yeah,
know. I
I
think
can tell you of one that I know of myself, Trupanion. You know what Trupanion?
mm-mm, no.
Trupanion is a health insurance program for your pet.
Oh, I have heard of
And
that actually. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's by far better health insurance than anything you and I will ever get in our whole lives. Because what happens is that they have a per illness deductible.
Hmm.
So, for example, the per illness deductible for my dog is $1,000. But for that illness, whatever it is, over the lifetime of the dog, once the deductible is met, they pay 90%, no questions asked.
Hmm. See, and that's how it should be. I had another experience with health insurance. I mentioned this to Ted, by the way. Uh, when he was on the show, where it's like somebody else I know who's an athlete was going to physical therapy for an injury, and after 4 sessions, the insurance was like, "Yeah, it's not medically necessary." And it's like, "What do you think it was fixed in 4 sessions? Are you insane?" So, and then anyways, it ended up getting sorted, but it's like they will try everything, anything and everything
Yes,
to not pay for it.
not pay. Yeah,
And it's so bananas that for myself, like I'm lucky to have kind of the network that I do of people in that physical therapy kind of realm where I can kind of sort that out myself. But for other things, it's not so right. Other people aren't so lucky to have that network, and for other things, I don't have that network either, and then it creates the same. Anyways,
well, I
um,
can make you feel a little better.
sure.
Um, you just have to compare it to places that have fully socialized medicine,
Well, that's
like, for
true.
example, the UK.
Yeah.
More than 10% of the population of the UK is currently on a waiting list for a procedure.
Yeah,
That's
it's
more than
not good.
7 million people. The other one that made me laugh my head off is they have a giant shortage of dentists. So whenever you see, for example, people with horrible teeth that are from an affluent country, they will always be from the UK. Now, this giant shortage of dentists, as it gets worse, the government decided to solve the problem by importing a lot of dentists and saying, look, you need to come and work here in the UK. Okay, well, firstly, they're paying such low wages that nobody wants to work for the National Health Service. But even putting that aside, they bring in all of these dentists, but then they say to them, oh, you can't work as a dentist. And so the dentists say, well, why not? They say, well, you need to pass a qualifying exam. And they say, okay, we're ready to pass the qualifying exam. Oh, well, there aren't enough spots to do the exam. So they have thousands of fully qualified dentists that are waiting to do an exam to practice in the UK at the low wages that they're being offered in the first place. They can't even do that right.
See, that just sometimes when you hear stories like that, you just wonder like why, like what is going on in these people's brains that they're like, yeah, it's a good idea to have them wait to anyways. Um okay, so oh yes, this was the other thing that I wanted to touch on. The how you started the hedge fund because we talked about the markets and people should invest. And then you also mentioned to me before we got started that you wanted to talk about some financial products that you wanted to make sure that people knew to
Not
be
buy.
yes, to not buy. Do you want to go
Yes.
with that? Let's start with that, and then I'm curious because I think the last time that we spoke, we didn't actually get into too much on how the physics of the market works. So I want to do a recap on that, at least for myself, because when I listened to the episode with remind me his name, the one that you sent me the other day.
Oh, with Wakar
Yes.
from Titans of Tomorrow.
Yeah, people, you should go check that out. That episode is really, really great, and Wakar did a great job on the interview. And he's obviously he's more knowledgeable about the sort of Wall Street thing than I am. So he has some very good questions, but I want to dive into that. But first, let's do the financial products that people should be wary of um, before I forget, and then we'll jump into some of the other things.
Yeah. So there are two things that are going to be sold to you. Um, the first thing that's going to be sold to you is crypto investments. And the thing to understand with crypto is that it has no fundamental value. That is to say, produces no cash flows. So basically, what you're betting on when you buy a crypto asset is whether or not that crypto asset has a lot of attention or not. The more attention it gets, the higher its price. The less attention it gets, the lower the price. That's your bet. So if you want to buy Bitcoin, by all means do so, but understand that there's no reason for it to go up, just like there's no reason for it to go down. There's no reason for it whatsoever, other than the fact that it's a magnet for people's attention. So if you want to save for retirement, or you want to save to become rich or whatever it is, you want to take a flyer on Bitcoin, fine, but don't do it with any significant portion of your net wealth. That's the first issue. Crypto assets, beware. The second thing that's going to be sold to you is something called private equity. So private equity started off on Wall Street as people noticing that certain companies were severely undervalued. So they would borrow lots of money, they'd buy the entire company, they would spruce it up, and they would fix it, fix whatever problems it had, and then sell it back into the market and make a nice profit along the way. That was private equity for the longest time. Now, private equity was quite successful, and it did a pretty good job over the years, so it made a lot of money. Now these funds have become gigantic. They've become so gigantic that that opportunity of buying companies that can be fixed up and then resold back into the market is essentially dried up. And so they are having a hard time making any significant extra profit from the investments that they make. Because if you make a private equity investment, you're basically saying, I'll be illiquid for some time, but I'm going to make more money than if I just put my money in the stock market. That's essentially no longer true. So since the returns have dropped, what they've decided to do, and they want obviously more and more capital so they can make more money, they've decided that the new pool of capital that they want the capital from is you, the ordinary investor. So just ask yourself, why is this giant Wall Street company coming to me and asking me to put money into this exotic instrument, private equity? And of course, the reason is, by the way, in private equity, you can charge very high fees. So it's not 1/10 of 1%, it's 2% plus 20%, which is much different. So they want to do stuff like that because they can make a lot more money from it. But you as the investor are not necessarily going to be better off. And then similarly, they're going to want to come and sell you venture capital investments. The problem with venture capital investments is that the best venture capital investments are made when the company is very, very tiny. Like, Facebook, the first 5 million that went into it is the great investment. But these venture capital firms have now become so big that they have to make $100 million and $1 billion and $10 billion investments. But then that means that the opportunity to make this outsized rate of return is gone. So what are they doing? Guess what? They're coming to you, the ordinary investor, and saying, hey, why don't you give us some money and we'll put that into our venture capital fund? These are all things, in my opinion, the ordinary investor should avoid. And the peculiar thing is that this is the only place I know of where it happens. By avoiding all of this sophisticated stuff, you will actually outperform all the people that do all the sophisticated stuff.
I want to talk about crypto for a second because I think by and large, I agree with that statement that it doesn't really hold value, and you're often taking flyers on stuff to right, there's they're called meme coins for a reason.
Yeah.
But with for example, Bitcoin and Ethereum, the US government and other governments, I think, don't necessarily agree with your position, right? El Salvador's bought a bunch of Bitcoin. There's other countries around the world that have bought Bitcoin reserves. We can talk about strategy, MicroStrategy or now Strategy as well, but because there's the crypto community is split up into the Bitcoiners and then everybody else. Because there's people that feel very strongly about Bitcoin that are very down on all the other ones. And so with Bitcoin in particular, just like you said, I've got some stuff, some $50, $100 things on some flyer. If it goes to the moon, great. If not, it's $50, whatever. But for Bitcoin, why then I guess if that's your opinion that it has no kind of store of no value added, why are governments around the world buying Bitcoin reserves? And it seems to be that there's a little bit more to Bitcoin than maybe the other ones.
Yes and no. Mainly the reason they're buying it is because it went up. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It goes up, so you buy more of it. Then it goes up, so you buy more of it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, don't forget the amount of attention that Bitcoin gets because it is the cryptocurrency.
Hmm.
That's the second thing. And the third thing to understand is that despite the fact that people are constantly saying that it should be a store of value or that it should be used for transactions or any of these other things, none of those use cases has ever panned out.
No, they haven't. However,
So
the block
essentially,
the thing with the blockchain is is where it gets me in terms of the
yes,
transparency of the transactions and that
yes,
you
that's
cannot
true.
fake a blockchain transaction.
Absolutely. Yes, but that's not Bitcoin. That's blockchain
Yes, yes,
technology,
yes, 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 for
right?
sure.
So I have nothing but positive things to say about the blockchain as a technology. It's great. It's a distributed ledger. It's one that can't be faked. Basically, it's one which is transparent. It's one that can happen in real time. All of these things are fantastic. You can use it to trade stocks. You can use it to trade assets, all of this stuff. But that doesn't help the price of Bitcoin. That's my point.
Mm,
And my point is only that the reason that Bitcoin's price has gone up is because it's had a lot of attention for a long period of time. So people said it's digital gold. It's not. They said that it'll be uncorrelated to other assets. It's not. It's almost perfectly correlated to the stock market
yeah,
with a leverage of 5. They said that it would turn into something that produced lots of transactions. It never has. They said that it would, revolutionize finance and so on and so forth. It hasn't done that either. I mean, I could just go on with a list of things that hasn't done. But what it has done is that it's allowed people to speculate.
yeah,
So its use is as a speculative asset. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm a libertarian. You want to speculate, go ahead and speculate. It's perfectly fine. But its purpose is speculation. And when you are speculating, then you are basically saying that the attention that it has today is a fraction of the attention it's going to have tomorrow or 6 months from now, whatever it is, so that its price will be higher than it is today. That's the statement. Because there is no other statement you can make. You can't say its cash flows will get better, it'll be managed better, whatever. You can't say any of those things, and none of them are true.
yeah,
Then people with Bitcoin love to say, oh, well, only 21 million can be mined and all that stuff. But that's irrelevant. So what?
yeah. I think also with Bitcoin, like if it's tied to the stock market ish, then it seems fairly safe of an investment from that perspective. And the other thing with Bitcoin
Then why not
is
just buy the stock market? That's my point.
exactly. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, but when you're speculating, right, you see this with kind of pump and dumps on meme coins, right? Like the Paul brothers had a meme coin that they were like, "Oh, look at this great thing," and then they sold it, and it went up. They sold it. Everyone lost all their money. Um, but you also see exchanges like Coinbase offering asset-backed loans, right? They give you US dollars off the back of how much cryptocurrency
Yes.
you have. So in terms of the management of a financial asset, normally you would think that a financial institution would not want to loan against something as potentially as volatile as that. But we're seeing almost a normalization of Bitcoin as just another asset.
Yes.
So
That's true.
does that change the calculus at all in terms of, yeah, you might want to just buy the S&P 500, but as a viable investment, right? As we talked about the devaluation of the dollar, as the dollar is worth less, then the Bitcoin will be worth more theoretically if it's tied to the stock market ish. Then you've got a similar sort of scenario where it's it's just there kind of.
Hard to answer, really, because that depends upon how many users you can have for Bitcoin.
Hmm.
So one of the real good arguments for Bitcoin was the Bitcoin Treasury Company, and the idea is we'll buy a bunch of Bitcoin, and then we won't just sit on it. We'll try to do something to that Bitcoin, and by doing something to that Bitcoin, we're going to add value to the pot of Bitcoins that we own, which is why we're becoming a Bitcoin Treasury Company. You should buy stock in our company, right? That which is also partly what strategy was saying and doing and so on.
Yeah.
Which is also why they had that premium for months, right? Where every time they bought $1 of Bitcoin, the price went up by $2, right? Which is no longer true. But all of that is absolutely fine. The trouble is that there still has not been, as far as I can tell, any significant use discovered for Bitcoin.
No, well,
So
it's the same as, well, I guess that's true because there's no transaction. Because I was going to say it's similar to a stock, but when you sell the
no,
stock,
stocks
I
have
mean,
cash flows.
they do. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, and
Whereas Bitcoin
that's
doesn't.
why I stopped the
So
question.
That's right. And then people say, well, you can stake Bitcoin and you can, from the staking, there'll be a cash flow and so on. That's true, but that's far from a use for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So really, you're right back to it's a speculative asset. People like to speculate, just like people like to gamble on sports and so on and so forth. And there are sports prediction markets and so on. That's fine. Those are all absolutely perfectly reasonable, regulated things. But you shouldn't really think of it as an investment per se, because an investment generally means that you are buying something that has the possibility of generating a cash flow at some point in the future. That's not true here.
Yeah.
From that point of view, by the way, Ethereum
Yeah.
could possibly be considered an investment in some cases
Yeah. Well, the state,
because
well,
it has smart contracts and so on. So
yes.
smart contracts take off, then Ethereum becomes valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. And Ethereum as well, you can stake and, well, you can do that with other things as well. But yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, let's talk, let's get into the physics part of your story with this, with the market, because I think just from people listening, what you've managed to do with that. And also this will set the precursor for an episode that will be later next year with some other physics friends slash colleagues. Friends, are they friends? Yeah, friends of yours.
Friends, good friends of mine, and very, very, very smart guys.
So let's kind of set the stage because well, actually, I'll just let you explain it, and then as you explain it, the theory that you use, can you define that a little bit in some of the terms? So as we go forward, the people just have a kind of glossary of what we're going through.
So do you want to talk specifically about the application of physics to the market, or do you want to talk more about systematic trading in the market? Because the two are a little bit different.
Physics, the application of physics in the market, because I think for me personally, that's like, okay, it goes up and down. Yeah, somebody talked bad about this company, it goes down. I would never have thought physics can be used for that. So it's very interesting to me.
Okay. So the thing that I did, and it worked very successfully for many years, is I used something called chaos theory to trade the S&P 500 futures. Now, chaos theory is very interesting, and it's something I talk about in my book as well. Chaos theory is a system that's perfectly deterministic, but it is a system where the output is heavily dependent upon tiny, tiny, tiny changes in the inputs. So the everyone's favorite example is that a butterfly flaps its wings in Bangladesh, and this produces a storm, in New York. Now, for many reasons, that's not quite true, but it is a very nice picture, and from philosophically, it is correct. So, in a chaotic system, what will happen is that you can end up with situations where short-term predictions are possible. So to put it another way, let's say that you've got a mathematical equation. It has, say, 5 inputs, and input 2 is 2.01117. And instead of putting in 2.01117, you put in 2.01118. And the result of that is that you get a completely different result. But that completely different result takes place not immediately. You have to iterate a little bit before you see the completely different result. During that short period of time, it's called bifurcation. During that short period of time before bifurcation starts to occur, the 1117 and 1118 will be very similar to each other. What that means is that you can take data, and if you assume that it's chaotic, then you can say that a pattern today, if I match a pattern today to some pattern in the past, then I can hypothesize that the very near future of today's pattern will be the same as the very near future of the past pattern. It's kind of pattern matching, pattern recognition. And that is what I was doing when I was trading using chaos theory, which is directly out of physics, to the S&P 500 futures. I was hypothesizing that the patterns that occurred in the past told you something about the very near future of patterns that occur today.
So can you give can you give an example of, well, how did it work how did it work in practice? Because did you have like a software that you ran it through, or like how did it work in
Yes.
practice?
No, I wrote the code.
Okay, so
can you give an
and
example?
tested the code.
Okay.
Can you give an example of
So
how it works?
yeah. So let's say that the S&P went 78, 79, 80, 77, 78, 79. So it goes like this.
Mm-hmm.
Now you go back in the past and look at all its past prices, and you try to find that sequence of 5 prices that is closest to this sequence of 5 prices. I'm simplifying a lot of things, but
Yeah.
that's the rough idea, right? Then you hypothesize that that past sequence of prices had a future. So the current future is going to be similar to the future of that past sequence of prices. That's the idea.
Mm.
Now, there's lots of complications and there's lots of things you have to do, and there's lots of things you have to do to make it work and all this other stuff, which is hours of explanation. But that is the nub of the idea, and it comes straight out of physics, which is that in a chaotic system, very near futures of areas that are close together today would also be the same if they were close together in the past.
That's super interesting. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about that was the last episode I had was also a hedge fund guy, but he's much more of the, and I think he would probably say that this is accurate, much more of the research, like people, fear and greed type, like momentum type investor. And I
Yep.
mean, and he's been doing this for decades and decades and decades, so he's been very successful as well. But it just goes to show like the difference of approaches and multiple can be successful. But then also from that perspective, you mentioned earlier, and he mentioned this as well, like for just people generally who want to get started in investing, he's like just buy S&P 500 or if you want, buy Amazon or something and just let it go and let it sit there, and you'll be
Yep.
more
He's
successful
right.
than most people.
Yep.
And so when you're sitting there and trying to outperform your benchmarks, and I kind of asked him this as well, where's the, are you fully like did it get off to a good enough start where you didn't have to second guess it, or were there time like how much tweaking were you doing and how much like before you're like, oh, this is a good idea, and then how did you get people to trust like, hey, by the way, I'm the only one that's doing this whenever you were doing it like before, as you mentioned in the last episode, I'm the only one that's doing this, but you should still give me money and trust that I'm gonna do that even though I'm the only one that's doing that. Like, how did that work as you're actually building your business?
I have the same problem now. Because I'm still doing something that nobody else is doing, which I can
Uh-huh.
explain in a minute.
Okay.
But I still have the same problem now because I don't fit into any box. And because I don't fit into any box, they don't have any box to put me in when they need to make an investment. So basically what ends up happening is essentially all word of mouth.
Mm.
There's no other way that you can do this. And so I don't sell, I don't market, I don't do anything. I just, if people come, that's great. And if they don't, that's fine too. Because essentially the idea is that I built this system to make myself happy. I built every system to make myself happy, but this system was really built to make me ultra happy in the sense that it fits my personality. In the past, I was building systems that also fit potential clients' personalities. I've stopped doing that years ago. This is for me. This is my capital that's at risk. And if somebody wants to come along for the ride, fantastic. And if they don't, that's fantastic too. And I don't
Mm.
worry about it. So that's the way I deal with that. It is a real problem. And the more different you are, the more people are like, say what? So that's a definite issue. Now, in terms of outperforming benchmarks, that's a very perceptive question. And I realized in 2003 that it was going to become harder and harder and harder for people to, it's called generate alpha. Alpha is outperformance over a benchmark. And so I decided that I wanted to abandon this entire pursuit and do things differently. And so I asked myself, what is it that cannot be, the technical term is arbitraged away. Arbitraged away basically means that the more people exploit it, the more it disappears.
Mm.
And the answer is, while alpha can be arbitraged away, that is to say, everybody knows the stock is undervalued, so everybody buys it. Now the stock goes up and is no longer undervalued, right? You can't arbitrage away risk, because risk is I sold, Oh my God, so that guy got a margin call, so he had to sell. Oh my God, so that meant this third guy got a margin call, so he had to sell. So all these people are selling because they're being forced to sell. So my question was, that can't be arbitraged away. Because it can't be arbitraged away, there must be a way of predicting not when it will happen, but when conditions are right for it to happen. And so my idea was, let me predict when conditions are right for that to happen, and I'll just simply stay out of the market when that happens. And the rest of the time, I'll be in the market, and I'll be long, and I'll be levered. That's the idea. So what I did from 2003 to approximately 2016, which is 13 years, is I built and tested every risk model you can think of on the street. Some of them have won Nobel Prizes. Every one of them is used by all the major investment banks, everything. And they have lovely names: ARIMA, GOTCH, RFEMA, EGOTCH, whatever. These are long acronyms, extended generalized autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity. So I would build these things. I'm a physicist after all. This is trivial. It's child's play, just a bunch of equations, write them down. And what would happen is every 3 or 4 years, they blow up. So you'd think that your risk was X, and it would be 5 times X. So every time I would ask people, hey, what happened? The answer was always, oh, don't worry about that. That's a once in a lifetime event. And so after a while, I started asking people, the lifetime of what? A lab mouse? What are you talking about? And it's then that I realized that these risk models are not designed to protect you against bad outcomes. They are designed to allow you to leverage other people's money through the roof. Because when they blow up, it doesn't matter. It's not your money. When that light dawned, I said, I don't need risk models. I need risk classification. And so what my models do now, if call them models, is they're really algorithms, is that they are able to find conditions in which market risk is such that if bad stuff happens, you'll get big collapses. So during those periods of time, I take lower than expected risk, sometimes down to zero. I'll be completely in cash. But the rest of the time, when market risk is not terribly high, I'll be long and levered. And that's how the system works. And then this means I don't have to worry about alpha, and I don't have to worry about trying to outperform a benchmark. I own the darn benchmark. I just don't happen to own it during periods of time when the risk is very high. That's it. That's the idea.
Interesting. So during COVID, were you completely liquid?
We were in cash. We missed the bottom, so it fell 30 something percent, I think, over like 10 days, something like that, right? So we started by losing on the first 7 or 8%. Then we were out. We sat out the entire decline. And then as the market started to go back up, we got in again. So we were out by 1st or 2nd of April. March, excuse me.
Yeah.
And then we were back in by early April, I believe.
So how would
superb.
you, like for that one, I think, well, for myself, I said that was fairly simple to predict that, okay, it's going to go down and then it'll go back up eventually. So when it starts to get into, I think it was like March 7th or something like that, when it hit the bottom, I just dumped a bunch more money in, but I didn't sell because I was nervous about how the taxes would work. So, but to that point, I was also this is in my like retirement accounts and things, so I wasn't planning on pulling anything out anyways, although I did have some other stuff that anyways. How complicated is, like, for example, and I would guess that you would never tell people to try to predict the tops and the bottoms. But if there's one
Hopeless.
that's maybe like a bit more easy to predict, like that one, where I think it was fairly obvious that eventually it would go back up. How do the taxes actually work if you're just in like a brokerage account and you sell some shares of S&P 500 or something? Is it complicated?
No, it's pretty simple. There are basically 2 tax rates. If you held the asset for less than 1 year, then you pay as ordinary income tax. So whatever your tax rate is, you pay that. If you held it more than 1 year, then you get a preferential tax rate, which is a capital gains rate. That's it. It's very simple.
And then whoever it is just sends you the form, and then you just put it on your taxes.
Yeah, your brokerage will give you this didn't used to be the case. It used to be a pain in the ass, but that's been sorted out. Now they tell you what your tax basis was, so you know what your profit and loss is. Straightforward.
Interesting. So for people Did we cover the question that you asked if people listening kind of knew how to invest and what to get into? Did we cover that, do you think, sufficiently, or do
Yeah,
you want to
I
go
mean,
over that?
I just want to repeat it again, which is buy yourself a nice index fund, outperform the vast majority of money managers. And if you want to take a punt on the tech sector, that's absolutely fine. Buy yourself QQQ.
Okay.
Sit at home and be happy.
Let's before we wrap up, let's chat a little bit about the book and kind of how that's gone. You mentioned the book tour, but how has it been kind of marketing? I saw so obviously with Wakar, that's probably is that the biggest podcast that you did?
Yeah, that's the biggest one I've done so far.
So how did that turn? What was the experience like with a podcast where it's more of a high value production, right? I'm also asking for my own kind of as a host, like how it went. Um, So how has it been? I guess I'll just leave the question as like a marketing for the book. How has that been as an experience for you, right? You mentioned that you don't market the hedge fund and you don't really kind of advertise these things, but to some extent you've had to. And how was that as an adjustment for you, kind of going on book tours, talking on or like local bookshops, signing books, copies, talking to people, going on podcasts, etc. How has that been for you as a whole over the last what's it been now? Wow, almost a year now, 9 months or whatever. How's that been for you?
Yeah, I like this stuff because, as I told you offline, I have more opinions and have gray cells. So, pontificating comes naturally to me. That's pretty easy. What's been most interesting to me, though, from these conversations, is that there are a large number of really thoughtful people, such as yourself, out in the world, and it's really exciting to meet thoughtful people. And the reason is not that you're going to agree with them. The whole point is that you don't agree with them. But the point is that you can learn something from somebody that's actually thought through what they're telling you.
Hmm.
Because you get people with, like, I had this conversation just a few weeks ago. Two friends of mine talking to each other, and one said some really absurd stuff, and the other one was getting a little bit annoyed. And so I decided to ask the guy that was saying absurd stuff. I said, "How do you know that?" And then he hemmed and hawed. And I said, "Well, no, but really, how do you know that?" Eventually, it turned out he'd read it in the New York Post. And so I said to him, "Look, you can't just read something in the New York Post and assume that it's true. You kind of have to put it through a filter. Does
Yeah.
this make any sense?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, you're right." So anyway, it's been wonderful to go to talk to people on podcasts, people like Wakar, for example, who are really thoughtful, are careful, and have really thought through what their own value proposition is. See, so one of the interesting things about Titans of Tomorrow is each value proposition is very clear, which is why they have all these sponsorships as well, which I'm sure you saw, is that they're going to go talk to a lot of traders and then try to elicit from the traders what it is that the traders think makes them successful. And then that becomes something that their audience can relate to and try to use for themselves and try to get better and so on.
Hmm.
And that's just been awesome. It's been great fun. And then I've talked on philosophy podcasts. I've had a couple of philosophy ones that have been wonderful. I've had one with I forget, having to do with the mechanics of how you write a book and what your writing process is and all that stuff. That was great fun. So it's just the fact that you get to talk to thoughtful people. That's really the best part of it. And then in terms of production values, the advantage of doing it the way they're doing it is that it helps, particularly with getting sponsorships.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's I think the biggest difference between what they're doing and what other podcasters perhaps do,
Yeah.
is that
That
it
makes
helps
sense.
really helps with the sponsorships.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think also the vibe I get from you when we talk offline is that you really just love doing it because every time you've got, hey, I've got another friend, do you want to talk to them? And of course, we've had three of those already. And I very much enjoyed all of them because the people, again, like you bring are very thoughtful people, and I learn a lot, especially like the one with Priya. I had no idea about Indian and Pakistan politics at all. So it's like, oh, now I need to prepare so I don't ask stupid questions. And then so you learn something then, and then you get to ask the questions to somebody who's an expert in that space.
Yep,
And yeah, that was,
exactly.
I mean, that was amazing. Speaking of experts and reading things in the New York Post and thinking that they're true, What are your opinions on kind of the media landscape and where things are going? Because there's been, I think, kind of people generally don't watch the cable news anymore. There's, I think, an opportunity for people to jump into like a still like a real investigative journalism space that I don't think exists. Like the podcasts have kind of took the place, but like they're not really news. They kind of are, but like not really. It's more discussions about current events. And then like for example, there's one guy named Kira Shishkin he's kind of got a VC background from Silicon Valley, and he's trying to do this startup where he pulls basically the business model is you pay like 4.99 a month or 8.99 a month or whatever it is now. And every morning or every whenever you set the time, they send you a text of 6 bullet points, like very, very simple of Trump put 50% tariffs on whoever. Venezuela did this, Iran did that. And then they send you a link in the text to whatever the article is. And I was like, okay, that's interesting, right? So they don't have sponsors. They make their money by the subscription fee. And I was like, okay, that's an interesting kind of piece. And then I talked with him offline because I clicked on some of the articles and I was like, yeah, but these are the same sources that everybody ran away from in the first place. So, anyways, he knows I told him that, so I don't think that's saying too much inside baseball. But anyways, where is your opinion on kind of where media is going? And I'll say generally the trust in institutions, right? Because as we talked about doctors before and the 4 minute visit and in the SSRIs, like and some of the other things, the food industry, people don't trust that anymore, et cetera. So I'll say using the media as an example, but more broadly, what is your opinion on the institutions because and where they're going? Because also, like, I would like to be able to trust the news and that the doctor says what I think they say, and I don't want to have to go research a bunch of papers to be like, hey, is this thing actually healthy for me or not? Or did this person actually tell the truth? Or like I would like to not have to do those things, you know? But this is the situation in which we're in. So I don't know, what are your opinions on that moving forward?
Well, so I actually wrote a book which is not published yet on because I haven't really tried to do it on how you should read the news,
Hmm.
um, and what basic knowledge do you need to read the news in such a way that you don't get misled. And so I go through all kinds of things. I go through, things like monetary policy and economics and the stock market and politics and elections and all this stuff. Just this is the state of knowledge today. This is what we know to be true. And if you know this, then when you read the news, you won't be fooled. That's sort of the idea behind the book. I spoke to a couple of agents. They don't seem interested. They don't seem to think it has a market, which surprises me. But anyway, never mind. Other people are starting to take up that mantle. So, for example, the Free Press is one of those that has started up as on Substack, and now the editor-in-chief is taking over CBS News, Barry
Is that
Weiss.
Barry Weiss?
Yes,
Yeah.
Barry Weiss. So that's one that is trying to do something similar.
Well, they've gotten a
Um,
bad rap recently because people have gone after them for the kind of how they've reported on Israel and Gaza and their kind of slant on that. I've seen
that's
that
true.
I've seen that recently. So like anyways, sorry, keep going.
No, that's quite true. Uh, that's one of the issues with media outlets is that frequently media outlet brands itself by being against something as opposed to for something. And the moment you're against something, you have the problem that you may end up adopting viewpoints that you don't necessarily or would not necessarily agree with if you were trying to think them through from scratch. So that's one of the downsides. But they are trying to create a sort of media that is not biased, as it were, or less biased, or however you want to think about it. So that's one. But I think that the growth of these platforms is actually what is new. So Substack in particular and Medium as sort of secondary, the growth of these platforms is telling you that there's a hunger for this kind of news that you're talking about and that people are willing to pay for it. So just to give you an example, I'm a subscriber to Noah Smith and Matt Iglesias. Now, I don't necessarily agree with Noah Smith and I don't necessarily agree with Matt Iglesias, but the difference is they think and they think in public and they explain to you what they think and why they think it. And more to the point, even though Matt in particular is a progressive Democrat, he's a thinking progressive Democrat, which is to say, when his side does something that he thinks is insane, he says so,
Jimmy Dore
right?
kind of.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what you want is more and more people like that. And I think Substack is a platform that's enabling that. And so my view of the media landscape is that people like the New York Times are basically only pandering to the people whose views they are whose views are being paid for. So in other words, their subscribers have a certain set of views. So the New York Times is going to echo those views back to the subscribers because that's where the money is.
Mm-hmm.
The heterodox thinking, hey, maybe you need to think differently about this, that has to be in a different platform. And that different platform, I think by default, is becoming Substack.
Yeah. What's funny about that for the New York Times example is like they don't realize that that's killing their subscriber base because they're only talking to one, they're talking to one people. They're not reporting on what the news is. Um, and the other thing, I would say the two guys that you mentioned, Matthew and Noah, I think you would probably say that you would classify them as genuine people or people with integrity.
Yes,
So,
definitely.
so where I'm going with that is as AI becomes more prevalent, I think that we're going to see more and more a kind of like you said, a hunger for one, the genuinity and the integrity of people who actually, regardless of if you agree, I think people are going to be more interested in I believe that this person is telling me at least, or like they at least believe what they are telling me, whether or not we agree. And I think people are going to go more towards that than I just agree with this person, which is why I think the podcast space blew up in the first place because I think like Rogan, for example, nobody thinks that he's lying to you. Like he, for whatever his faults are, if you agree, disagree, he seems to be, and millions of other people think so, a genuine person. And he will tell you when he got something wrong. Sean Ryan, the same. I don't know if you're familiar with Sean Ryan, but he's a former Navy SEAL and CIA guy that he's more in kind of like the military space. He came out with a clip yesterday or 2 days ago, and he said, it was basically 2 minutes, and he was like, "This I said this on the podcast last week. I got it wrong. I apologize to this person. These people are great, and this was the stat that I said that was wrong, and this is the actual stat." And it's like, wow, amazing. Thank you for that.
Yep.
Um, and so I think from that perspective, like genuinity is going to win the day, and integrity is going to win the day. And for me, that gives me some optimism, I think, in the media space. And then the problem just becomes people have to know where to find it, because it's very much decentralized. You don't just turn on the TV and somebody's talking to you anymore. You have to know where
Well,
and how
I
to
think
find it.
that's where Substack has its niche, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because one good place to find it is Substack. The other place
hmm
is Medium. So,
yeah,
on both of them, you don't get a lot of crap.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's for the written one for sure,
Yeah,
definitely.
you mean for visual? Yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
because YouTube is not that great.
No, YouTube and then even Rumble has its problems. It doesn't
Yeah,
center as much, but it still
yeah,
has its kind of
yeah.
issues.
Yeah, I
Um,
don't have a good answer for that,
yeah.
really.
Um, then the last thing I wanted to ask you about, or the last big kind of topic was, you've kind of jumped back into the physics world, I don't know, semi-recently, the last couple of
Yep.
years. So how has that gone? And kind of, I want to tie it into your conversation with Wakar because I have seen some of the fallout from that on Substack where we've recommended each other as follows. And so a couple weeks ago, I started getting all these oh, this person followed you, this person subscribed to you on recommendation from Samir. And I was like, oh, I wonder what happened. Like, what did Samir do? But you started to put out papers on Substack more recently. What made you get back into physics? And then has the kind of, I'll say, well, maybe there hasn't been enough time for you to feel kind of the difference of the boom that you got from going on that show and kind of the amount of subscribers that you got. But what made you get back into kind of writing those papers and exploring that subject, and then how's it been with the influx of new people? Has the reception has been good? I hope it seemed like that way from the comments, anyways. But how's that
Yeah, I
been?
mean, the comments have been great, which has been nice. A lot of people have actually emailed me and sent me messages and so on, and I've responded to all of them because it's nicer than to contact me. In terms of why I got back into physics, um, I was already about 2.5, 3 years ago, I was back to reading physics textbooks. I can't tell you why I started reading them, but I was reading them and I was enjoying reading them. And then I mentioned to a very, very good friend of mine in Toronto that I was reading physics textbooks. And he said to me, why don't we do some physics together? And I said, oh, yeah, okay, why not? Let's do some physics together. I'm old and over the hill, but what the hell? Um, and so then we started doing some physics together. And I pretty rapidly realized that, well, this was great fun. And it'd been a long time since I'd done it. And so he and I wrote a chapter in a book, which is coming out soon. The chapter's already up, on what happens if you take an experiment, the famous double slit experiment in quantum mechanics, and you move it ever closer to a black hole. So we figured out what happens in that situation, to see if there was something interesting. In particular, can you do such an experiment on Earth? And the answer is not anytime soon. But it's interesting to see that happen and work it out. And then at the same time, I just started playing, and I've had 30 something years of staring at financial data. And one of the biggest mysteries in physics is, why do particles have the masses that they do? So to begin with, everything in the world is made up of electrons, protons, and neutrons, right? And protons and neutrons are made up of quarks. Electrons are fundamental particles, and neutrons and protons are made up of quarks. So you have quarks and electrons. That's it. Okay, very good. But everything is made up of the up quark and the down quark and the electron. But we have two other copies of each of these things. The electron is a heavier cousin called the muon, which is identical except for the fact that it's heavy. And then a tau lepton, it's called, which is even heavier. Nobody knows why. These particles seem to have no function other than they decay into the electron. So why do they exist? Nobody knows. And then the up and down quarks have two cousins called charm and strange, and top and bottom. Each side has 3 generations. Why? No one knows. And then, even more weirdly, they have the most bizarre masses. So I think the top quark is 80,000 times heavier than the up quark. Why 80,000? No one has a clue. So I said to myself, just in December last year, I'm a trained physicist. I've looked at data my entire life at this point. Maybe I can see something that other people haven't seen. And I found it. There is a pattern. It's a very simple pattern. And my paper, by the way, is now up on the European Journal of Physics C. So if anybody wants to look for it, you can find it. It's a very simple pattern, and it requires only 2 inputs: the charge of the particle, which is the simplest possible thing you can think of, and its generation number, which is either 1, 2, or 3. That's it. The entire formula needs 2 inputs, and it tells you the ratios of all the particle masses. So this, then I said, oh, this is really interesting. And then it took some time to convince people that this random guy from finance with a tagline of VS Asset Management is actually doing physics that is worthwhile, that should be published in a proper physics journal, which is a big thing. So anyway, they finally said yes, and it's up on the European Journal of Physics C. And even more peculiarly, there's a thing that physicists use to circulate preprints, which is to circulate non-peer-reviewed papers. That's called the archive, ARXIV. They will not allow me to post any papers. You're not a physicist, you're some idiot. But I can nevertheless publish papers in the most prestigious journal in the world. That's okay. It's absolutely bizarre. So, the gatekeepers keep their gates, whatever. The archive wants to behave like, whatever, people with 2 behinds, that's whatever. I don't care. But yes, I can publish in good physics journals and say things that people seem to find interesting. So yeah, so I found it. That paper is up, and now I'm working on some physics to try to explain where that pattern comes from.
Is this kind of what makes you tick, just solving problems?
Yes, but real problems. I hate puzzles. I don't do puzzles.
Okay, so here's a real problem for you. And then I said that was the last one, but this is the last one. I think, because then it's been almost 2 hours, which has been bonkers. So I had a friend of mine who used to work in quantum physics, and then he went on Love is Blind and now gets sponsorships and does whatever. And anyways, that episode, by the way, for those listening, is Garrett, and you should go listen to it because fascinating guy. Anyways, he's been on a couple times. The first time that we talked kind of about UFOs and like teleporting and that sort of thing. What is the situation with that, right? There's been lots of kind of chatter about the UFO thing. The Age of Disclosure documentary is coming out relatively soon, if it's not out already. Rogan, of course, is a big pusher of this just because he's fascinated in the subject, and so he brings
Yep.
people on and whatever. And so, what's your take on the way that these things are reported to travel? Like how does that work, or would it work, or is it possible, or well, like without going into too much of the weeds, but like is it even like is it plausible?
See, the problem is that there are a fair number of people that I respect, that I don't think are crazy, that don't agree with me.
Mm,
So there are a fair number of people that think that these are actually UFOs,
okay.
and these are not crazy people. So, but my problem with all of them, and I've asked several of them to give me an answer to this, and not one of them has given me an answer to this question, is how do the aliens get around the problem that the speed of light is their limit? Not once has anyone given me a sensible answer to that question. Because the problem is that the instant you realize that the speed of light is the light speed limit for the universe, then where are these people coming from? How are they
Mm.
even getting here? Um, and if they're any kind of biological life form, what are they doing? Just living for generation after generation after generation after generation in a spaceship and never arriving here, but then somehow remaining hidden from us for 50 years? It just seems peculiar. And then similarly, some of the other stuff that they talk about, oh, we saw these lights and they moved like this and they moved like that, and so on and so forth. Some of those seem to again violate the laws of physics. To again, I say, give me any plausible mechanism by which that could happen under physical law
Well,
that
this
we
would
pretty
be
well understand at this point.
the answer to that would be if you listen to Bob Lazar, who was one of the scientists that work on, or apparently one of the scientists that worked on the thing, would be they've got this way that it seems like like they are able to bend space-time somehow, right? And this is where I get lost because I'm like, okay, I guess that makes sense from like conceptually, if you had a way that you could like go through a wormhole or something and pop out the other side somewhere else. Like, I don't know how that would actually work, but that was also the explanation then for why nobody's gotten a good picture of these things because they're not really, not that they're not really there, but like I don't know. It's all very confusing to me from the standpoint of like how it all works because like you said, it's like the speed of light. It's like, well, then it would take them forever to get here from wherever they're coming from. But
So,
there also seems to be enough where it's like, okay, it doesn't seem like we're alone in the universe. And so if so, then how does that like how would they get here in a way that makes sense or that I don't know.
so this it's a thank you for bringing that up. This has been looked at very with a lot of detail. So there's a thing called an Alcubierre metric. There's a physicist called Miguel Alcubierre from Mexico who found that you can find a solution of Einstein's equations such that you could take a spaceship and you could squeeze space in front of it and expand space behind it in such a way that even though the spaceship was not moving faster than the speed of light, you would actually be covering space faster than the speed of light.
Hmm.
So you would not, in fact, be violating any physical laws. The problem is that this requires giant quantities of negative mass.
Hmm.
As far as we know, there is no negative mass in the universe. We can't see it,
Yeah.
right? So where is it? We should be able to see it somewhere in the cosmos. We don't see it anywhere. We don't see negative mass anywhere. And then the second point is that the amount of mass that would be required is approximately the amount of Jupiter.
Mm.
So then people say that there's some incredibly advanced civilization and has figured out some ways around this problem and so on and so forth to produce faster light travel. Okay, but the problem with that is that you're now sort of taking far-fetched hypothesis on top of far-fetched hypothesis on top of far-fetched hypothesis. And I'm like, guys, you need to say something credible. You can't just say it might be possible. I mean, anything might be possible. That's not really very scientific.
Yeah.
You have to have some grounding in physics, anything. And there's none.
Yeah. This is the thing that he mentioned. It was called, I think, Element 115 was what they talked about, where it's like it kind of creates this like almost if you had a magnet, you push two magnets and they like propelled each other, but with like the air around it kind of. And then the way that Garrett described the like teleporting thing to me was like if you had space time and you like curled it up like this and then you punched a hole through it that way. And so I was like, okay, well that makes sense. But yeah, I don't know. The whole thing to me is like, I don't know. It's very interesting, and part of it is like, well,
So
is this a giant red herring to distract us from other things that are going on in the world, or like, does the U.S. military have some of these just sitting out somewhere in Nevada and they're waiting to pull them out when something really crazy happens? I don't know.
I don't know, but even on the wormhole point, that's also been looked at.
Mm,
And it's not definitive, but it's pretty strong evidence that even if you could create such a wormhole, it would collapse instantly if you tried to put anything through it.
hmm.
It's not
Interesting.
definitive, but it's
Yeah.
pretty damn strong evidence
Would there
because we
be a
can do that with
way?
known physics.
Would there
Hmm?
be a way if they had some kind of like even if it I don't know. There's all these like scenes in movies where like they're going out of a collapsing tunnel and they like shoot themselves out the other side. Is that I don't know how that would work, but I don't know.
It runs into problems when you start to combine quantum mechanics and general relativity.
Mm,
And we don't quite know how to do that anyway because quantum gravity, we don't have a theory of it, but we know enough of it. It's called semi-classical gravity to know that the chances that this will work are very low.
okay. Well, let me ask you this then, and then we'll wrap up. In terms of the limits of physics as we know them, I mean, science is always discovering new things. How certain are we that all of the things that we know are like that's it? Is like there's something that we don't know about, some element, some way of whatever that is like just we're not capable of understanding, or like is that in the realm of like are we at a spot where right at one point we didn't have a combustion engine, at one point we didn't have flight, at one point we didn't even know what the speed of light was, at some point we didn't know all these things. Is there more progress to be made on some of these things? Like where does quantum mechanics take us and all these other things?
Yes, but with a giant caveat.
Mm,
Fundamental physics is unlike any other science.
okay.
In fundamental physics, once you know something, you know it forever. Newton discovered Newton's laws in the 15th, 16th century, whenever he discovered them. In the realm in which those laws apply, they are still true. They will always be true.
Mm,
Einstein discovered general relativity in 1916 and special relativity in whatever, 1905. In the realm in which those are true, they will always be true. The electron exists, the proton exists, the neutron exists. Those are made of quarks. That's always going to be true. The physics of biology is one theory in physics is called quantum electrodynamics, which is the theory of light and ordinary matter, and that is always going to be true. That's never going to change. So I like to say that the physics of biology is already known and has been known for almost 100 years at this point.
yeah.
That's never going to change. But what is going to change is in the realms in which we already know this stuff is not applicable. That's the areas in which we're going to discover new stuff.
Mm, so we're looking
So
for
at very high
new
energies,
contexts and new scenarios
yes.
and
So
okay.
very high energies, we might discover new particles, we might discover new forces, we might discover all kinds of new things, but not at low energies. That's done.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. And the second thing is that we already know that to a very, 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 very good approximation, the general theory of relativity is correct. So any deviations from the general theory of relativity are going to take place very close to black holes or something along those lines. Because already we can calculate what happens when black holes merge, which is the largest explosion in the universe, right? Billions of suns explode in a couple of seconds. We can calculate that and get the exact right number, just to give you an example. So we already know that even in that extreme case, the general theory works. So in those realms, in even more extreme realms, we don't know yet. That's the areas where we can make some progress. But in low energy, we already know it. It's already known.
Yeah.
Now, applying it or deriving things from it or trying to get to chemistry even from physics, that's a different question. That's very difficult to do. But the fact that we know the law by which chemistry operates, that we already known it for 50,
Yeah.
60 years.
Yeah. And then also you run into the question of if well, by what we know, the way that these things are have reported to move, the G forces would be too much for any
That's
human
another issue.
anyways.
Yep. Yep.
So There's a whole bunch of issues for sure, but also a whole bunch of evidence, and I think I don't know. It's really, to me, it's just fascinating. I don't really have a stake in it one way or the other. I'm just like, okay,
Yeah,
this
neither do I.
this, but it is interesting to think about, for sure. So, with that, well, it's been 2 hours. That's crazy. Do you have any kind of last nickels or thoughts before we get you out of here? Things that you want people to
No, I'm
know?
all set. That's my book up there, The Science of Free Will. Please buy it. Make me happy. Thank you.
Thank you guys for listening. Links will be in the description as always. Samir, absolute pleasure as always, and looking forward to the next one that we got going on.
Excellent.
And for those listening, well, I'll repeat myself again. Go buy the book, and we'll see you guys next time. Peace. Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.